Went, the Beatles were acclaimed with enthusiasm which bordered on frenzy, and the driving force behind them was songwriter and rhythm guitarist John Lennon. Second marriage by spending his entire honeymoon with Yoko Ono in bed as a public demonstration against violence. After the Beatles split, he moved to America, a successful solo career. He'd become something of a recluse. Meanwhile, the Cavern Club in Liverpool has been turned into a car park. The only reminders of its are a statue paid for by the group's fans and a new club over the road with the same name. Lennon's last interview was with Radio 1 DJ Andy Peebles. He talked about his latest LP and family life with Yoko.
We're pretty damn steady, I'd say that. We're in good condition, thank you very much. It's great to talk to you, and it's not kindness. We want to sell the record.
By their grief. By this morning, the gates of John Lennon's luxury apartment block had become a shrine. People came, one by one, to place flowers and photographs of the former Beatle on the iron-barred gates. All who came here were expressing their shock and outrage at what had happened.
It's senseless. I was totally shocked. I can hardly talk. I can't even believe it really happened. John Lennon was the greatest person in the world.
I feel like, everything that John Lennon sang about, wrote about the Beatles, just to kill him with a gun is ridiculous.
It's like shooting a friend. It's like a death in the family. And my parents even thought it was hard for them to understand why I was crying, but I love the man,
Thank you. Norman Reese, ITN, at the late John Lennon's apartment in New York.
Beatlemania, London, 1962. Of the four, Lennon was the rebel, and it was his words that made their music.
Well, she loves you. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves
The phenomenon that inspired hysteria amongst teenaged fans across the globe was cradled in the Cavern Club in Liverpool, near where John himself was born. By the early 60s, the group was travelling worldwide, and at every airport, the same scenes of uncontrolled adulation greeted them. As they moved from concert to concert, police had to be on hand at every venue as often as not to carry away the victims of faintings and exhaustion. By 1965, all four were virtually members of the establishment, as loved by royalty as by their fans. Even the Prime Minister of the day was on Christian name terms at the Variety Club Awards.
I'd just like to say the same as the others. Thanks for the Purple Hearts. Silver, oh yeah. Sorry about that, Harold.
With desperate fans clambering up the gates of Buckingham Palace, the climax of their recognition came with the award of the MBE to each of them. But Lennon, whose rebellious streak was to find greater expression now, was to hand his medal back in protest at the Vietnam War. So, the same year, Lennon made his classic utterance about the Beatles having become more popular than Jesus Christ, a view he felt had been misunderstood.
I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. But I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
It was perhaps in search of some spiritual dimension that the Beatles flew off to India. In the tranquility of an Indian garden, John Lennon walked apparently finally in peace from the years of Beatlemania. His time with the Maharishi evidently inspired his work for a time, so too did his increasing feeling of frustration with the world as he saw it.
We're going to stay in bed for 7 days, instead of having a private honeymoon. It's a private protest.
For the violence that's going in the world, you see.
To say,
we feel that instead of making war, it's better to just stay in bed. Let's stay in bed for the spring.
And grow your hair.
Yes.
For peace. Let it grow till peace comes,
Nobody ever loved me like she did.
Yoko Ono's arrival on the scene led some to believe that she was to be the eventual cause of the Beatles breaking up. But in truth, Lennon seems to have found in her much of what he'd missed in earlier life, with the early tragic death of his mother and the breakup of his family.
Yes, she does.
So, like the others, Lennon was to go his own way, exploring the themes dear to him in numbers like My Mum Is Dead and Working Class Hero. 5 years passed in which he produced little music, but in which he and Yoko started a family. And then, a month ago, this album, with which now he will have to be remembered.
The ex-Beatle Paul McCartney said John Lennon would be missed by all the world. And another member of the famous team, George Harrison, was too shocked to talk about his friend's death. McCartney's agent gave Paul's reaction.
Tonight at our London studios, Paul McCartney said he was deeply shocked and saddened at yesterday's tragic death in New York of John Lennon. Paul said John was a great man who will be sadly missed by the world, but remembered for his unique contribution to art, music and world peace.
There was obviously a rift between Paul McCartney and John Lennon. When was the last time he spoke to John?
I believe they spoke about a year ago, and I'm not aware really of any great rift. They've been friends for a long time and worked together for a long time.
Has Paul been in touch with Yoko Ono?
They have spoken on the phone, yes.
How did Yoko Ono take it? Did Paul tell you?
I couldn't tell you, no. I couldn't tell you.
Has he
but obviously, I mean, how did she take it? I mean, upset, I would.
Okay.
The record producer who helped to make the Beatles internationally famous is George Martin, the man they called the fifth Beatle. He's here now. Mr. Martin, you must have been musically closer to John Lennon than almost anyone else in those early days. How much of the Beatles was in fact him?
Well, he was obviously a very important part of it. He and Paul were the main creators of the music of the Beatles. Although each one of the Beatles was pretty important, you know. They were all very much a team.
Did you have any feeling in those early days that they were going to be as big as they eventually became, and so much of a social influence?
We were too busy to think about it, quite honestly. We obviously knew what was happening when it did happen, but we just got on with it.
What did you feel when Lennon went off to live in the United States? Did you feel he was leaving something behind that he could have built on here?
I think he probably, if he'd been able to stay in England, I think it would have been better for him, because I think that the United States is a bit of a crazy place anyway. But he found his peace there. You know, he was able to shut himself away from the world, which he wanted to do for a while.
Mr. Martin, I'm afraid there we must leave it. And we go to Liverpool, where it all began, where they're talking of a permanent...
Contribution as somebody who looked as an observer at the Beatles did John Lennon make? What was he to the Beatles?
Well, the Beatles as a whole were a group of genius, and John gave an element to them which other people couldn't give. I mean, we've heard all the appreciations today. He was the abrasive one. He was the original one, the unusual person in it. He was the rough and tough and rebel and aggressive. I think Paul probably basically had more musical talent, has more musical talent, is more gifted. But John was the one that really knocked him into shape and stopped Paul being far too schmaltzy and being too sentimental. John was the tough guy.
Is it fair to say, as I implied at the start, that in fact he was a bit of a contradiction, really, as a person?
No, I mean, the last 5 years you've heard about him sitting in these Manhattan flats and being a complete recluse. From my knowledge of him, which I must admit only lasted for 18 months in the 60s, he was like that all the time. I remember going down to Weybridge to interview him, and I spent 3 days with him in his swimming pool. He didn't say a word. He swam running around. He wasn't drugged. He wasn't stoned. He was just lost in his own imagination. He always was that. He wasn't the leader of the group because he wasn't interested in really what the public thought of him. He was just himself. He wasn't trying to dominate.
Jimmy Tarbuck, looking back to those early days in Liverpool when you were knocking around the pool yourself, what comes to mind? What would be perhaps your favourite memory of John?
Well, you're talking about a man who's the biggest influence on an era, of my era, in music. His music will live forever, and because of this stupid piece of refuse that's done this to him, who might get away with it because that's the way the law is. I mean, because I would be very adamant this man must be killed for me, for what he's done, an innocent guy like that. But the greatest memory I've got with him was one night down here in London at the Hammersmith Odeon, when the screaming was so loud, I was stood in the wings, and he turned and smiled at me, and he went, "Hey, Tarby, watch." And they were playing one of the songs, and he didn't sing, he just moved his mouth, like that, miming it, and I just roared laughing, because he said, they can't hear us. And I can't tell you how choked I mean, everybody is at home. I mean, it's just absolutely diabolical that a talent like this has been just flagrantly wasted on a pavement in America. It just totally upsets me.
Do you think, as I suggested perhaps to Hunter Davis there, that he did change over the last few years, that he became a different person, or was that always John?
Not at all. He was always like that. He was his own man. He was cynically, he was very funny, very witty guy, and he would not suffer fools at all. But I mean, if he found someone who interested him intellectually, and he was a very intelligent lad, he was always great company, you know. And you know, I'm not talking about him as though he was my best pal. He certainly wasn't that, but he was always a great fella to see occasionally and have a laugh with. And
Jimmy Tarbuck, Hunter Davis, thank you both very much indeed for joining us. Well, John Lennon may be dead, but his music will live on. Not only, though, through his records, but through another Lennon, his 17-year-old son, Julian. Already he's an accomplished guitarist and was one of his father's most ardent fans. He heard the news of the tragedy at Ruthin in North Wales, where he now lives with his mother, Cynthia. She remarried twice when her first marriage to John Lennon ended in divorce. Judy Finnegan went to the house in Ruthin today.
The curtains at the windows of Cynthia's house here in Castle Street have been firmly drawn all morning. Inside, Cynthia and John Lennon's 17-year-old son, Julian, are being comforted by Maureen, Ringo Starr's ex-wife and still a good friend of the family. Cynthia was in London on a business trip this morning when the news was broken to her by her present husband, John Twist. She and Maureen Starr drove up to Ruthin together, and Cynthia, reputedly too upset to even talk about her ex-husband, has remained inside ever since. John Twist opened a bistro in Ruthin 12 months ago, and the girl who was John Lennon's wife was once the envy of millions of teenagers, now lives a quiet and uneventful life in this tiny Welsh town. Julian goes to Ruthin School about a mile away from his home, and despite the fact that his parents' relationship was until recently fairly distant, has lately been in frequent telephone contact with his father. Julian was brought back home from school by friends today, where his mother broke the news of his father's murder. He was whisked protectively away from newsmen by his stepfather, John Twist. With Cynthia still too stunned to talk, it was he who spoke to the press.
She's very, very upset, you know. It's come as a great shock, you know, and I think she's not only obviously upset about the death of John, but also, you know, on the effect it's having on Julian, you know, to lose his father in such a bad way.
Does Julian know yet?
Yes, he knows.
John Lennon didn't write an epitaph for himself, and there were times when some people may have been hurt by the things he said and did. But before we look back at his life, just listen to what Lennon himself had to say about it. And he was born on the 9th, October the 9th, 1940, in Newcastle Road, Wavertree. He first went to school at Mospitz Lane Infant School in Childwell and then to Dovedale Primary in Allerton. He passed the 11+ and went on to Quarrybank High School, a boys' grammar school, where his rebellious nature inevitably got him into trouble. Harry Dortch, you in fact taught him at Quarrybank. What sort of a person was he?
Well, I always remember him as sitting on the back row with a sort of sardonic contempt for authority, artistic rather than academic, if I can give you an example. For example, we had one day a French test for the whole class. When I walked round, I saw that instead of doing his French test, John Lennon was drawing a portrait of me. It was rather good, but a bit unflattering.
That was when you threw him out of school?
I threw him out, and I gave him a task to do. I said, now, you will produce 50 different faces before you come back. The next morning, he duly turned up with 50 different faces, and most of these faces resemble very closely my colleagues on that staff.
Harry Dortch, thank you very much indeed. In 1957, at the age of 17, Lennon joined the Liverpool College of Art. Clearly, he had talent for words, music and humour, but not for art. Lennon would sooner duck out of art classes and go to watch a Presley film, or with George and Paul go home and play music, while his Aunt Mimi, who brought him up, was out at work. That was John's way.
He, as an art student, well, he wasn't a particularly significant art student, but the group he was with was. And I was teaching for a long time, and I always remember that group, not just because John Lennon was in it, but because of other characters who also, you know, have made a place in the world. Not quite to the same extent as John, of course.
When you, as the years went on, saw John Lennon going on in the way that he did and making the contribution that he did and changing as he did, what was your reaction as somebody who knew him very closely?
First of all, I didn't really know John very closely. I mean, he wasn't an easy person to know. I was absolutely knocked back by the music. I mean, I'm not into music, really, but I just couldn't help but enjoy Beatle records, not just because of the sound, but because of the poetry, because of the honesty, because of the genius of the man who's an artist looking at society as it was and able to express it as it was.
The story of how John, Paul, George and Ringo got together and became first the Silver Beatles, then just the Beatles, is now legend. But the man who first put them on the road and became their first manager